You're the filmmaker. You've decided to break up a scene into separate shots. So how will you make sure the viewer knows where everything is located in the scene space? If we see one character in one shot, then another character in the next shot, viewers will need to understand where each one is located. Over the history of film, one common solution involves what's called analytical editing. Here, the filmmaker provides an overall view, often called an establishing shot. That shows us all the important areas of the space. Usually that means showing where the characters are in relation to one another. Then the filmmaker can cut to closer views of parts of the space, fairly confident that the viewer will remember where characters are when they aren't on screen. This progression from an establishing shot to portions of the space is called analytical because the overall space is broken down or analyzed into parts. Our sample scene from the Maltese Falcon in Chapter 6 of Film Art shows this process at work. When Bridget O'Shaughnessy comes into Sam Spade's office, we see her first from behind Spade's shoulder. Then, as she moves to the desk and takes her seat, her action prompts director John Huston to provide a wider, establishing shot. Once we understand where she and Spade are located, Huston can analyze the space into closer shots of each one. Note that Huston employs over-the-shoulder framings that also remind us of the other character's presence. In the course of analytical editing, the filmmaker can vary the scale of the shots to emphasize reactions more clearly. In our chapter, we point out several cues that remind us where characters are, even if they're off-screen. The most basic is the 180-degree principle, which always keeps us on one side of the action. The 180-degree system allows directors to use characters' eyes to reconfirm characters' locations. This is the technique of the eyeline match. Cutting to something that is being looked at by one character tells us that the off-screen character is still where we assume he or she is. Analytical editing can get more complicated when you have several characters in the locale, so directors are usually careful to make positions and eyelines consistent in each shot. See our Connect extract on Shaun of the Dead for examples of how this is done. Analytical editing is a basic part of filmmakers' craft and is used constantly in films and television programs today. But there's an alternative to analytical editing that has creative possibilities, and some filmmakers have chosen to use this. It's called constructive editing. As the name implies, this means that the filmmaker doesn't analyze an establishing shot into closer views. Instead, the filmmaker withholds the establishing shot and builds the scene's space, constructs it, entirely out of those closer views. Here, cues like position, the angle and direction of eye lines, and our common sense knowledge of space help us understand where characters and landmarks are. Sometimes budgetary considerations make constructive editing necessary. If you can't fly your cast to Paris, you can show your hero looking off-screen and cut to a shot of the Eiffel Tower, suggesting that he's near it. Constructive editing was used in the early years of cinema, although it wasn't always called that. The young Soviet filmmaker Lev Kuleshov noticed the technique in American films and realized that it offered advantages that went beyond cost savings. The famous Kuleshov experiments, which we discuss in Chapter 6, suggested that the viewer's mind added something to the separate shots. What happens between shots, we might say, happens in your head. At the very least, the viewer is likely to assume that the characters seen in separate shots were in the same locale. Constructive editing could build up a space without ever showing all of it. The Soviet filmmakers who learned from Kuleshov became quite skillful at suggesting that characters in different shots were really nearby one another. One of Kuleshov's students, Vsevolod Pudovkin, used constructive editing to strong effect in his 1927 film, The End of St. Petersburg. It's the story of the Russian Revolution of 1917, in which rebels seized the Winter Palace that formerly housed the Tsar's family. A woman wanders the grounds looking for her husband, hoping to give him some potatoes. But before she finds him, she winds up giving potatoes to all the exhausted and wounded fighters along the way. When she finally finds her husband inside the palace, he's shown in a tight medium shot, frowning at her. She looks uncertainly at him in a tight close-up. A separate shot shows her empty pail. After another fighter grins, she smiles, and her husband breaks into a smile. That's the end of the film. An American director would have been more likely to bring the two characters together in a medium shot, perhaps in an embrace. But Pudovkin keeps them in separate shots to the very end. This allows him to emphasize the details of performance, the emotional shift toward happy expressions, the husband's realization that his wife has given away his potatoes to his comrades. Soviet directors believed that often the establishing shot was waste footage, and they wanted to create sharper single impressions more quickly than their Hollywood peers did. The Soviet silent filmmakers used constructive editing very often, but nearly all directors used the technique for some scenes. More recently, a few directors have combined constructive editing with unusual camera positions. Wes Anderson, Takeshi Kitano, and others had developed a style of frontal framing combined with constructive editing. They frame one character or a set of characters head-on, as if posing for a group photo, and then cut to show other characters looking straight back at them. In effect, these directors have put the camera right on the 180-degree line between the characters. This may be a little hard to identify as constructive editing, but it is. There's no establishing shot revealing all the characters in a single frame. Few directors have made so original a use of constructive editing as the French director Bresson. His films are known for the same sort of brusque, pointed style we find in The End of St. Petersburg, but with a quieter, more minimal feel. Bresson believed in neutralizing his actors' performances, so their expressions are often blank or subtle. We have to guess what they're thinking. Moreover, he often treats scenes through details of hands or feet. This stylistic choice sometimes forces us to think about whose body we're seeing. Bresson's dry, precise style is given additional force by constructive editing. Bresson's Pickpocket is a study of an isolated young man who believes his superior intelligence permits him to break the law. He tries picking pockets, and after some tutoring by professionals, he becomes quite good at it. In several sequences, Bresson uses close shots and constructive editing to show us both the risk he runs and his growing skill. Here's a good example.
Ce tour ne nécessitait aucune aide. C'est une grande dextérité que je n'avais pas encore. La chance me souriait. Un doigt encercle le bracelet, l'empêchant de pivoter. Pendant que le pouce délivre le cuir, elle fait sortir de la boucle. Je m'y exerçais souvent.
From the start, Bresson doesn't give us an establishing shot of the entire street. Instead, we simply see Michel step into a frame and turn back, as if he's looking for a new target. Cut to his mark, the man who gets up from the bench. Not quite a point of view shot, it still relies on our general sense of location, a city street, and Michel's eye line to suggest that they're not far from each other. Cut back to Michel stepping to the center of the sidewalk and sizing up his victim. Again, the eye line match cues us to the location of each man. Michel's voiceover, which we hear throughout the film explaining things to us, indicates that he's trying this theft without the help of his friends. But the voiceover adds suspense because he admits that he isn't completely expert and so might get caught. Cut back to the businessman crossing the street. You might have been a little surprised to see how far away he is from Michel, since the earlier shot of him suggested that he might be just a bit down the pavement. But this shot builds suspense while setting up Michel's method. The man must cross through traffic, and Michel will take advantage of that traffic. Cut back to Michel staring. Then he lowers his eyes and moves forward. Cut to Michel's feet, striding onto the crosswalk and meeting the oncoming feet of the businessman. This is a very unusual establishing shot, bringing the two men together in the same frame, but its emphasis on body parts is typical of Bresson. In the course of the pocket picking, we'll never see the faces of the men. The camera tilts quickly up to the men's hands so that we can study Michel's technique. He seizes the businessman's wrist. But this might seem a disastrous move since it's so aggressive. Wouldn't it announce that Michel's goal is theft? As he wrenches the man's wrist, Bresson cuts to the wheel and fender of a car that is slamming to a stop. Again, this is constructive editing. No establishing shot has shown us where the car is in relation to the men. Again, we see feet. The businessman's legs carry him on over the curb with a little hop. It's now clear that Michel has pulled him out of the car's path. The men's hands come into sharp focus. When the businessman drops his hat, Michel keeps his hand tight around the man's wrist, as if helping him to steady himself. A gesture of rescue has become a gesture of companionship. The businessman leaves in the foreground, and only after he's gone do we get a glimpse of the wristwatch that Michel has taken. Fortunately, his lack of expertise hasn't betrayed him. In the next scene, we'll see Michel practicing removing a wristwatch with more care, and Bresson's dissolve emphasizes once more Michel's hands. What we've just seen is a practice session like the one that follows. In this street scene, we don't hear a word of dialogue, only a few traffic noises and the sound of footsteps. Dialogue would have distracted us from Michel's maneuvers. In realistic terms, it's a bit strange that the target never speaks, but that would seem more peculiar if we saw the men's faces. By keeping our attention on Michel's feet and hands, Bresson has not only focused on the key elements of the scene, he has kept us from noticing the strange social dimensions of the action. Just as important, Bresson has used constructive editing adroitly. The cutting initially connects the men, then shows the car, without benefit of establishing shots. Do we feel we need them? I don't think so. Bresson engages us by showing details that we have to put together. Michel plus his mark. Michel's hand gripping the mark's wrist. The car slamming on its brakes. Michel's hand steadying the victim as he stoops. Bresson trims his scene down to the core elements with not a wasted shot. The whole action takes less than 1 minute. His cutting builds suspense and forces us to think about what we're seeing and to wonder what will come next.